go ahead and open with me to the book of Ruth. We're going to continue our discussion groups tonight, and we're going to be talking again about these characters in Scripture. Last week we talked about Lot, but we're mainly talking about not just characters from Scripture, but characters that have a little more to think about, a little more to chew on. And in Ruth tonight, we're going to be talking about one such character, and that's the woman Mara, or Naomi. Now, the story of Ruth, as you would probably guess from the book, right, is about Ruth. This is a story about Ruth, about what Ruth does, how Ruth connects from her original space as a Moabitess, so a foreigner, and becomes all the way into the line of Jesus Christ and becomes a direct ancestor to David. So some of the most important people in all of Scripture come through Ruth, right? So that's this whole process. But throughout this book, the character of Naomi tells another story, a story that is incredibly important to consider, to think about, of who she is, what she goes through, and the situations that cause her to make the choices that she ultimately makes. A couple quick things about Naomi here. You can kind of read here, and there's more context about the book of Judges, not the book of Judges, the book of Ruth itself. If you go to the very first verse of the book of Ruth, it says, during the time of the judges. Now, what's really interesting here is that if you go back to the previous book, Judges, there is a almost direct link here in the way that you can kind of see between the two here. If you go to verse 25 of Judges chapter 21, so the very last verse of the book of Judges, it says this, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. There's your context. You want to know what Israel's like, what Naomi and her husband, the world is happening around them. That's what the situation is. Everyone is doing what they view is correct in their own eyes. There's no king. It's basically a free-for-all, no man's land. There is no stability. And in this midst of instability comes even more instability. In verse 1 again of Ruth chapter 1, it says, during the time of the judges, this unstable time, it says, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. So not only is it completely unstable, but also, bam, your entire food source wiped out, gone, right? So they have to leave. Now this shows there's a little inkling here of this kind of lack of faith, of not trusting God to fulfill the promises that he gave to them in the promised land, right? That he's going to provide for them. But there is immense instability. The thing they rely on the most to live is now gone. So they have to leave. They have to go somewhere. They're reaching out. They're looking for stability. Naomi is the woman who comes with this. It says in verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. So that's the initial thing that pushes Naomi here. Completely unstable times. A famine pushes them out of their original home place where they live. They have to go somewhere else. It says in verse 3, here's where it starts beginning to kind of cascading down, right? It was already kind of bad with the famine, having to move away, but notice what happens to Naomi. It's just like hit after hit after hit. Verse 3 says, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. Naomi's entire family just gets decimated. Husband, both sons. And all she's left with are these foreign daughters-in-law who just married into the family, and that's all she has left. She'll illustrate this point when she eventually makes her way back to Bethlehem, to Israel. Spoiler alert, sorry. She makes this point. So eventually what ends up happening is that she ends up saying, all right, it's time for me to go back. My husband's dead, my sons are dead, let's go back. Let's go back to where I was supposed to be from. This is verse 7. It says, she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. And verse 9 says here, so amongst all of this horrible situation, we notice one central piece of who Naomi is. And this will be repeated all throughout the book. It says this, Naomi said to them, referring to Orpah and Ruth, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She kissed them and wept loudly. Naomi, number 1, is a caretaker. She loves and cares for Orpah and Ruth and will do anything to see what she deems to be their best interests. She says, you don't have to follow me back. She'll keep going here. She says, verse 11, verse 10, when Orpah and Ruth refuse and say, no, we're going to keep going with you. Naomi says, why would you do that? That makes no sense. She says, return home, my daughters. This is verse 12. It says, go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share because the Lord's hand is turned against me. Naomi cares for Ruth. Naomi cares for Orpah. She says, this is the only logical solution for you to do. Go back to your own people. Find new husbands. I can't provide what you need. She's caring. But you notice what she says there? The reason why? Verse 13, it says, no, my daughters, my life is much too bitter. And that word bitter is repeated. Jump all the way down to verse 20. Actually, verse 19. This is after, so what ends up happening is that Orpah ends up leaving, right? And Ruth comes forward and makes this great declaration of faith of saying, my God, your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. And he says, I'll be there with you. Ruth commits to Naomi. So they travel back to Bethlehem. And when they get to Bethlehem, you can kind of almost, you can picture in their mind, they're coming back. It's been years, over a decade at this point, right? They come back into Bethlehem. You can kind of hear the town all around them kind of perking up. In verse 19, where it says, when they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? But Naomi answers and says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me? There's fun little wordplay in here where Naomi's actual name means pleasant. And she's changing her name to Mara, which means bitter, a direct reflection of how she feels in this moment. Let me ask you this question. Have you been in pain before? Well, maybe that's physical pain. Maybe that's emotional pain. Maybe it's mental pain. Maybe it's any of those things. Have you suffered? I would say the overwhelming majority on some level would say, yeah, I've suffered at some point in our lives. People have been through the death of loved ones. People have had everything and then lost all of it. Job, a great story of someone who had it all, right? Because God blessed him. And he lost all of it, right? Naomi was living in the promised land with a husband, with these beautiful children, in the place that God has set out for them. And then one by one, it all just came crashing down. The place where she lived, the people she loved, her identity gone, just like that. I oftentimes, when I read this story, I kind of didn't empathize enough with Naomi. I saw the things that she said and say, hey, you can't say that about God, which is also true, right? but it's the way Naomi feels. If you want to do some direct translations here, what she means when she talks about how the Lord has afflicted her, or this idea, or has brought me back empty, if you really dig down, you can find some really dark synonyms here about how she's talking about how she feels like she's been ripped. She's been ripped away from who she is. She feels like she's been carved out, just completely removed from who she was. That's how she feels. And I didn't empathize enough with that when I first read it, but now I realize a bit more that what Naomi's saying here is that she's hurting. She's in pain. And so she says, I can't be called Naomi. You can't call me pleasant because I'm not. Now, does that go a little bit too far and she starts pushing back and blaming God for this? Yeah, she does. But I want you to notice here that even through this pain, Naomi stays similar in a lot of ways. If you keep going through the entire book of Ruth, you'll notice as Ruth begins to work in the fields of Boaz, eventually begins to connect with Boaz all the time, and continually through there, you still have Naomi's guiding hand. If you notice here at the beginning, in chapter 2, it says this is verse 22. It says, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, my daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants so that nothing will happen to you in another field. She also says in verse 20, if you go back up, it says, the man is a close relative. He's one of our family redeemers, or kinsman redeemers, that phrase you've ever heard. She's basically saying, there's now a chance, and then she guides Ruth towards what ends up happening, which is her marrying Ruth, having Obed, and eventually that leads to Jesse and then David, right? It's this guiding hand of Naomi, even through all the hurt, even through all of the pain, eventually gets to a point where her life glorifies God, and she becomes really a surrogate part of the complete lineage of Jesus Christ. The point here is this. As we talk about Naomi tonight, and we talk about the pain that she went through, so some of the things that she did, I want you to remember this. In those deep, dark moments of pain, God is not afflicting you, he's forging you. He's not putting you down for no reason or allowing you to go through these things for no reason. No, he's doing it because he wants you to be refined. He wants you to go through the fiery trials and come out stronger than ever before, because that's what he does with Naomi and the story of Ruth. Now you see Naomi's name, Pleasant. She thought that she needed to change it. She thought that she needed to reflect this bitterness that she had become, but truly God said, you are Naomi. You are pleasant. And I have a plan for you. You don't need to change your name. You don't need to change your identity, because you have everything you need because I gave it to you. Tonight, as we continue to talk about Naomi, I hope you dig more into the Word. Hope you listen to those speakers and you involve yourself in the conversations. And I'm really excited for all the things we can talk about tonight. At this moment, if you feel like you're downtrodden, if you feel like you're in the middle of the fires, come tonight. Whether you want to respond publicly, whether you want to respond privately, whether you want to connect with your church family who would love to pray and support you, or you just want to connect back to God, we encourage you to do all of that. If there's any way we can help, please come as we stand and as we sing.